The first rounds didn't sound like warning shots. They landed with precision. High ground. Interlocking fields of fire. PKM machine guns cutting across the valley before the helicopters had even settled into their descent profiles. The MH-47 Chinooks were still flaring at 8,000 feet when the first RPG streaked upward, slow at first, then suddenly fast. Too fast. Inside the lead aircraft, operators from the 10th Mountain Division and attached elements of 1st Battalion, 87th Infantry had already begun their dismount sequence. Rucks weighed over 45 kilograms. Oxygen was thin. Temperature hovered just below freezing. They had been told resistance would be light. It wasn't. The valley floor of Shah-i-Kot opened like a bowl, ringed by ridgelines rising above 10,000 feet. Perfect observation points. Pre-sighted. Prepared. Someone had already been waiting. Above them, orbiting at altitude, an AC-130 gunship adjusted its sensors, searching for muzzle flashes. A Predator drone fed grainy infrared imagery back through satellite relay to analysts sitting thousands of miles away. Signals intelligence units had monitored chatter for weeks. Nothing had suggested this. Nothing had suggested this scale. Then the second Chinook took fire. This time, the rounds hit the fuselage. Not random. Not panicked. Disciplined bursts. Controlled. On the ground, the first elements pushed off the landing zone and immediately lost momentum. Movement slowed to meters, not kilometers. Every step uphill exposed them to enfilade fire from fighters who understood the terrain better than any map could show. Radio traffic began to fracture. Requests for close air support surged through the chain. Platoon leaders pushed to company command. Company command escalated to the Battalion Tactical Operations Center. The battalion fed into Combined Joint Task Force Mountain. Clearance took time. Time they didn't have. At that altitude, even breathing became a calculation. Every movement taxed the body. Every delay compounded exposure. The plan had assumed speed. Instead, they were static. Pinned. Above them, unseen but present, Al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters maneuvered along goat trails and rock shelves they had used for years. They shifted positions between bursts, never staying long enough to be fixed by thermal imaging. They were not reacting. They were executing. Back in the command post, the assumption still held. Light resistance. Localized fighters. A collapsing enemy. It had been. Briefed. Repeated. Reinforced. Even now, as reports of casualties began to filter in, the language didn't change. Not yet. Because systems don't fail all at once. They fail slowly. And then all at once. They had everything. Predator drones circling at 15,000 feet, feeding infrared imagery through satellite links into forward command nodes. AC-130 gunships stacked in holding patterns, armed with 105mm howitzers and 40mm Bofors cannons. U.S. Air Force combat controllers embedded with ground units, laser designators ready, radios tuned to multiple frequencies. And yet, the first hours collapsed into confusion. The insertion plan had been built around speed. U.S. Army Rangers from the 75th Ranger Regiment were tasked with establishing blocking positions on the high ridgelines to prevent escape. Simultaneously, elements of the 10th Mountain Division and Afghan militia forces would sweep the valley floor, pushing enemy fighters into those blocking elements. It was clean on paper. It assumed control, but the ridgelines were already occupied. When the first Ranger Chalk attempted to land on Takur Ghar, the helicopter came under immediate and accurate fire. Not probing fire. Not scattered resistance. This was pre-sighted engagement. The kind built over days, not hours. The MH-47 was forced to abort. In the process, a Navy SEAL from a DEVGRU reconnaissance element fell from the aircraft onto the mountain. The decision to go back for him would trigger one of the most violent small unit engagements of the operation. But even that hadn't yet been fully understood at the command level. Because the reports coming in didn't align. Some units described light contact. Others reported being pinned by heavy machine gun fire from multiple directions. Afghan partner forces began to slow, then fragment, then pull back entirely in certain sectors. No single picture held. At Bagram Air Base, inside the Combined Joint Task Force Mountain Command structure, officers tracked the operation through fragmented radio transmissions, UAV feeds, and delayed situation reports. The assumption persisted. Resistance was limited, disorganized. It had to be. The intelligence picture had been built over weeks. Signals intelligence units had intercepted communications. Human sources had reported scattered fighters regrouping in the Shah-i-Kot Valley. The assessment was consistent. A few hundred fighters at most. Light weapons. Minimal coordination. That assumption shaped everything. It dictated insertion points. It dictated force composition. It dictated the absence of preparatory fires before the air assault. The plan relied on surprise. But surprise requires ignorance. And the enemy wasn't ignorant. As daylight expanded across the valley, the problem became visible. Fighters moved between hardened positions. Trenches connected firing points. Heavy weapons, including DSHG heavy machine guns and recoilless rifles, had been placed along the ridgelines with overlapping coverage. This wasn't a refuge. It was a defensive network. U.S. forces began requesting increased close air support. The Air Force responded, but the process wasn't immediate. Target identification required confirmation. Clearance required authorization. Aircraft had to be retasked from other orbits. Minutes stretched. On the ground, minutes became casualties. A platoon attempting to advance 300 meters uphill took over an hour to move less than half that distance. Every exposed position drew fire. Suppression required coordination, but coordination required communication. And communication, at that altitude, in that terrain, degraded. Radios cut in and out. Calls overlapped. Requests conflicted. The system strained under its own weight. Meanwhile, Al-Qaeda fighters adapted in real time. They fired in short bursts, then displaced. They used caves and rock overhangs to mask thermal signatures. They avoided clustering, denying effective airstrikes. They understood what they were facing, and they understood how to survive it. Back at the command level, the narrative began to shift, but slowly. Reports of heavier resistance were acknowledged, then contextualized, then partially dismissed. Reinforcements were considered, but the scale of the problem was still unclear. Because admitting the true scale required dismantling the original assumption. And that doesn't happen quickly inside a system designed for certainty. So the operation continued. More helicopters were tasked. More troops inserted. Into the same valley. Into the same fire. By midday, casualty evacuation flights had begun cycling in and out under fire. Medics worked under exposure, stabilizing wounded at elevations where even basic tasks became physically exhausting. The plan had not accounted for this level of resistance. It had not accounted for prepared defenses. It had not accounted for an enemy that had chosen the battlefield. And yet, the system continued to behave as if the original plan still applied. Because changing a plan mid-execution requires clarity. And clarity was the one thing they didn't have. They had sensors. They had firepower. They had numbers. They still didn't have understanding. And the valley kept proving it. The problem was not resistance. The problem was expectation. Everything that followed came from that single fracture. The intelligence architecture feeding Operation Anaconda had been built on layered inputs. Signals intelligence collected by Task Force Orange had intercepted fragmented communications moving through couriers and low-power radios. Predator drones had tracked intermittent movement across the Shah-i-Kot Valley. Human sources, filtered through Afghan intermediaries, described a regrouping force, damaged, retreating, disorganized. Each layer reinforced the same conclusion. A weakened enemy. But each layer shared the same limitation. Distance. Signals intelligence captured transmissions, not intent. The language was coded, often ambiguous, and deliberately sparse. Analysts reconstructed meaning through patterns, not certainty. A drop in communication was interpreted as fragmentation. It could also mean discipline. Predator feeds showed movement, but only in fragments. Fighters moved at night, under rock cover, through terrain that broke line of sight every few meters. Thermal signatures flickered, then disappeared. Analysts filled the gaps with probability. Probability became assumption. Human intelligence carried its own distortion. Afghan sources operated within tribal dynamics, local rivalries, and survival incentives. Information moved through layers of translation, each step reshaping detail into something more useful, more acceptable, more aligned with what the recipient expected to hear. Consistency emerged. But consistency is not accuracy. By the time the intelligence reached Combined Joint Task Force Mountain, it no longer reflected uncertainty. It reflected agreement. An agreement is persuasive. The operational plan was built around that agreement. Air assault into the valley. Rapid envelopment. Blocking positions established by the 75th Ranger Regiment along the eastern ridgelines. Afghan militia forces advancing through the valley floor. U.S. conventional infantry securing key terrain. Speed would collapse the enemy. But speed assumes the enemy is slower. That assumption had already failed before the first helicopter lifted off. Al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters had not concentrated in confusion. They had distributed. With intent. Small units occupied pre-selected positions along elevation lines that dominated every likely landing zone. Heavy weapons were emplaced with overlapping arcs, not random coverage. They had studied the terrain. More importantly, they had studied the pattern. American doctrine favored air mobility. Insert fast. Seize key terrain. Apply overwhelming firepower. The valley presented limited options for insertion, and those options were predictable. So they prepared for them. The ridgelines weren't just high ground. They were observation platforms. From 10,000 feet, movement in the valley could be tracked in real time. Helicopter approach routes were exposed long before landing. There was no surprise, only timing, and the defenders controlled it. The failure began the moment the operation relied on synchronized movement across multiple units without shared situational awareness. The Rangers on the ridgelines, the 10th Mountain Division in the valley, the Afghan forces advancing unevenly, all depended on timing that required clarity. But clarity never arrived. Communications degraded under terrain masking. Radio relays struggled to maintain continuity. Requests for support moved through layers. Platoon to company, company to battalion, battalion to the joint command structure. Each step introduced delay. Each delay widened the gap between reality and response. Air power, the decisive advantage, became constrained by process. Targets required confirmation. Friendly positions had to be verified. Clearance authority sat above the units taking fire. Control was centralized. Exposure was not. At Takur Ghar, that gap became visible. The decision to insert a SEAL reconnaissance team onto the peak had been based on the same assumption: limited enemy presence. The team was meant to establish overwatch, to bring clarity to the battlefield below. Instead, they landed into a fortified position. The enemy had already claimed the peak. When the MH-47 attempted insertion, it entered a pre-sighted kill zone. Heavy machine gun fire struck the aircraft during approach. The helicopter was forced to pull away under fire, unstable, compromised. One operator fell. The immediate decision to return wasn't tactical. It was human, and the system followed it. A quick reaction force, composed of Rangers, was redirected to recover the fallen SEAL. The decision bypassed the slower intelligence reassessment cycle. It moved faster than the system could validate. Because speed had already been built into the plan as a necessity. Now it became a liability. The second insertion faced the same conditions. Enemy fighters, already positioned, engaged immediately. The Rangers dismounted into fire. Movement was restricted to meters. Casualties occurred within minutes. The peak, which was supposed to provide dominance, became a fixed point of vulnerability. All of it traced back to the same misalignment. The problem was not that the enemy was stronger. The problem was that the enemy was understood incorrectly. Technology had mapped the valley. It had not mapped intent. Firepower had been prepositioned. It had no clear target. Command structures had been established. They were built for a different fight. What unfolded was not a failure of capability. It was a failure of interpretation. They had visibility. They did not have comprehension. And in that gap, the enemy operated freely. The shift didn't begin with a new weapon. It began with hesitation. Not hesitation in the field. The men on the ground didn't have that luxury. Their decisions were immediate, physical, irreversible. But above them, inside the command structure, something slowed. Not visibly, but enough. Reports from Takur Ghar no longer aligned with the operational model. Rangers from the Quick Reaction Force were no longer maneuvering. They were fixed, pinned against rock and snow, returning fire at distances under 50 meters. Close enough to hear movement. Close enough to understand the difference between scattered resistance and prepared defense. That distinction reached the command node. And for the first time, it wasn't filtered out. Inside Combined Joint Task Force Mountain, the chain of command began to adjust. Requests that had previously been delayed for confirmation started moving faster. Air assets were retasked with less hesitation. The authority to engage began to shift downward, closer to the units in contact. Not completely, but enough to change behavior. Because the system had begun to recognize something it hadn't accounted for. The enemy wasn't reacting. He was dictating tempo. That realization didn't come from intelligence reports. It came from friction, from repeated failure to advance, from consistent, disciplined fire across multiple sectors, from the inability to establish uncontested ground anywhere inside the valley. The battlefield was already structured, not by them, so the doctrine had to change. The original plan had treated the valley as a containment zone. Insert, sweep, block, collapse. A linear model. Movement from point A to point B, with firepower applied to accelerate outcome. That model required initiative. But initiative had already been taken. So a different approach began to emerge. Not formally, not announced, but visible in how units started to operate. Instead of pushing forward, they began to anchor. Small elements of the 10th Mountain Division shifted from maneuver to survival-based positioning. They dug into shallow cover where they could, established interlocking sectors of fire, reduced movement to necessity only. They stopped trying to dominate terrain they didn't understand. They started trying to hold it. Above them, U.S. Air Force combat controllers adjusted their methods. Instead of waiting for fully confirmed targets, they began working with pattern recognition, muzzle flashes, repeated firing points, likely avenues of movement between rock formations. Imperfect, but faster. AC-130 gunships lowered their engagement thresholds. Orbit patterns tightened. Fire missions became more frequent, less deliberate, more responsive to ground-level observation rather than centralized validation. It was a shift from precision to pressure. And it worked. Not immediately, not cleanly, but the enemy's freedom of movement began to narrow. Positions that had been used repeatedly became liabilities under sustained air observation. Fighters who had relied on short bursts and displacement now faced persistent overwatch. The sky, which had been distant, became present. But the most significant shift didn't come from firepower. It came from adaptation in how information was trusted. Previously, intelligence flowed downward. Analysts interpreted, commanders decided, units executed. Now, that flow began to invert. Ground truth started overriding projected models. A Ranger squad pinned on Takur, Ghar didn't need confirmation of enemy strength. They were in direct contact. Their reports carried weight not because they were verified, but because they were immediate. That changed response times. That changed targeting. That changed survival. Even Afghan partner forces, initially fragmented, began to re-engage under more controlled conditions. Not sweeping advances, but localized movements tied to identifiable enemy positions. Their familiarity with terrain, previously diluted by poor coordination, became an asset when used in smaller, controlled engagements. The operation stopped trying to be fast. It started trying to be accurate. And accuracy, in that environment, meant something different. It wasn't about knowing everything. It was about knowing enough to act without hesitation. The system hadn't been redesigned. It had been forced to adapt under pressure. And in that pressure, a new doctrine began to take shape. Not written, not taught, but executed. Control was no longer assumed. It was negotiated, meter by meter, ridgeline by ridgeline, through air, through ground, through fragments of understanding stitched together in real time. They hadn't solved the problem, but they had stopped pretending it was simple. Night didn't reset the battlefield. It exposed it. At 2:30 local time, the temperature across Shah-i-Kot dropped below -10 degrees Celsius. Wind moved across the ridgelines in irregular bursts, cutting through exposed skin and freezing sweat into fabric. At 9,000 feet, every breath burned. Every movement required intent. On Takur Ghar, the Rangers were still there, pinned behind fractured rock, their fields of fire limited to narrow angles between snow-covered outcrops. Distances had collapsed. Engagements happened inside 30 meters, sometimes closer. There was no maneuver left, only survival. Staff Sergeant Matt Naylor's element had established a shallow defensive position just below the crest. Not by design, by necessity. The ridgeline above them was still held by Al-Qaeda fighters, positioned in hardened crevices and shallow bunkers carved into the rock. The enemy had elevation and patience. Every attempt to move upward triggered immediate fire. PKM bursts, RPG backblasts flashing in the dark. The Rangers responded with M4 carbines and M249 saws, firing controlled bursts, conserving ammunition. Resupply wasn't guaranteed. Extraction wasn't immediate. Above them, an AC-130H Spectre circled in a tight orbit, its infrared sensors scanning for movement. The crew worked through layers of interference, terrain masking, heat signatures from spent weapons, shifting shadows across uneven rock. They didn't see everything, but they saw enough. A muzzle flash, a repeated firing point, a silhouette moving between positions. The 105mm fired. The round impacted just below the crest, sending rock and snow into the air. The effect wasn't total destruction. It was disruption, enough to force the fighters to shift, to break rhythm, to lose timing. On the ground, that shift mattered. The Rangers moved 5 meters forward, then stopped. Again, at lower elevation, elements of the 10th Mountain Division had abandoned the idea of advancing in formation. Platoons broke into smaller units, maneuvering along terrain that offered partial concealment: dry creek beds, rock shadows, shallow depressions in the valley floor. They weren't pushing anymore. They were probing, each movement tied to observed enemy fire. Each position selected based on survivability, not dominance. Air Force combat controllers embedded with these units worked continuously, radios pressed to their ears, relaying coordinates, adjusting fire missions. There and /PRC 148 and PRC 117 radios cycled through frequencies, maintaining fragile links to aircraft overhead. Danger close became routine. Distances between friendly forces and targets shrank below 100 meters. Sometimes less. The margin for error narrowed to seconds. Above 15,000 feet, F-15E Strike Eagles and F-16 Fighting Falcons rotated through strike windows, guided by laser designation and GPS coordinates. Dams were released with calculated precision, but even precision had limits in terrain like this. Explosions echoed through the valley, but the enemy remained. Because they weren't concentrated. They were distributed. Small teams of fighters moved along pre-established paths, shifting between firing points that had been prepared in advance. They used caves not as shelters, but as transitions. Temporary cover before re-engaging from a different angle. They understood persistence. And they understood restraint. Back on Takur Ghar, the situation compressed further. A second Ranger element, inserted as part of the quick reaction force, had linked up with the original team. Casualties had already occurred. Communication with higher command was intermittent, fragmented by terrain and damaged equipment. Captain Nate Self, commanding the Ranger element, coordinated through partial information. His decisions were based on what he could see, what he could hear, and what his men reported in fragments between bursts of fire. Higher command wasn't absent. It was distant. Requests for immediate extraction were complicated by the same factor that had defined the operation from the beginning. The enemy owned the high ground. Any helicopter approaching the peak would enter the same engagement envelope that had already damaged multiple aircraft. The risk wasn't theoretical. It had been demonstrated. So extraction was delayed. Not denied, but delayed long enough to matter. Instead, additional air support was redirected. AC-130 fire intensified. Fast movers adjusted attack runs to suppress identified positions along the crest. The goal wasn't to eliminate the enemy entirely. It was to create a window. Seconds, maybe minutes. On the ground, the Rangers prepared for it. They redistributed ammunition, checked weapons, adjusted positions to cover likely enemy approaches. Casualties were stabilized as much as possible under exposure. Tourniquets tightened. Morphine administered. Blood froze against fabric. Time moved differently at that altitude. Slow in action. Fast in consequence. Then the window opened. An MH-47 Chinook from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Night Stalkers, approached under reduced illumination, terrain following as much as possible. The pilots flew low, using the contours of the mountain to mask their approach until the final ascent. They knew the risk. They had already seen the result. As the helicopter rose toward the landing zone, suppressive fire from orbiting aircraft intensified. The AC-130 fired again, walking rounds across the crest. F-15Es released munitions along identified enemy positions seconds before the helicopter entered the engagement zone. The idea wasn't safety. It was saturation. The Chinook flared hard, rear ramp already lowering before full contact with the ground. Rotor wash kicked snow and debris into the air, reducing visibility to near zero. The crew chiefs signaled aggressively, pushing for speed. Rangers moved, not in formation, in fragments, carrying wounded, dragging equipment, covering each other with short, controlled bursts into the ridgeline above. Enemy fire returned almost immediately. Rounds struck the helicopter's fuselage, Metallic impacts, sharp, unmistakable. The pilots held position for seconds that extended beyond training thresholds. Then lifted. The aircraft dropped slightly before gaining altitude, engines straining in thin air. The ramp remained partially open as the Chinook descended away from the peak, moving out of the engagement envelope as quickly as physics allowed. On board, medics worked without pause. On the mountain, the remaining elements adjusted. Because not everyone had been extracted, and the fight hadn't ended. Elsewhere in the valley, the operation continued to evolve. What had begun as a rapid assault had transformed into a series of localized engagements, each defined by terrain, visibility, and immediate decision-making. There was no single frontline, no clear boundary, only pressure, sustained, uneven, constant. U.S. forces began to leverage what had always been available but rarely fully utilized: time. Instead of forcing movement, they allowed the battlefield to settle into patterns. Enemy firing positions that repeated were marked, tracked, and eventually targeted with coordinated airstrikes. Movement corridors used by fighters became predictable over hours, not minutes. The valley began to shift. Not dramatically, but enough. Fighters who had initially dictated tempo now faced continuous observation. Not perfect, not complete, but persistent enough to disrupt their rhythm. The system hadn't become flawless. It had become adaptive, and in that adaptation, control started to emerge. Not imposed, earned, through friction, through delay, through a slow accumulation of understanding that couldn't be rushed, couldn't be forced, and couldn't be replaced by technology alone. The operation didn't accelerate. It stabilized. And in that stability, the balance began to change. By the end of the 10th day, the valley stopped resisting in waves. It resisted in fragments. Pockets of fighters remained along the ridgelines and cave complexes, but the cohesion that had defined the first hours was gone. Movement between positions had become dangerous. Every exposed path risked detection. Every repeated firing point invited precision strikes. The battlefield hadn't been cleared. It had been thinned. U.S. forces no longer attempted to sweep the valley in a single movement. Instead, they isolated sectors, one ridgeline at a time, one cluster of caves at a time. Air support was no longer reactive. It was scheduled, layered, continuous. B-52 stratofortresses operating at altitude began delivering heavy payloads across identified strongholds. The scale was different now. Not precision alone, but volume. Entire sections of the valley floor were reshaped under sustained bombardment. It wasn't efficient, but it was effective. On the ground, elements of the 10th Mountain Division and 101st Airborne Division advanced only after those strikes, moving deliberately, clearing positions that had already been broken by pressure from above. Afghan partner forces followed in controlled intervals, no longer leading the push, but reinforcing presence where resistance had already been reduced. The order of movement had reversed. Air first, then ground. Not because it was preferred, because it was necessary. On Takur Ghar, the peak that had defined the early failure, control was finally established. Not through a single assault, but through repeated engagement. Airstrikes softened positions. Small units advanced incrementally, securing ground that had already been contested multiple times. The mountain didn't fall. It was taken in layers. Bodies were recovered. Equipment retrieved. Positions reoccupied, this time from the top down. What had been a vulnerability became an anchor. Elsewhere in the valley, remaining fighters began to withdraw. Not in organized retreat, but in small groups, using the same terrain that had protected them to disengage. Some moved east toward Pakistan. Others disappeared into cave networks that extended beyond mapped systems. There was no single moment of collapse. No definitive end. Only a reduction in contact. Radio traffic shifted. Fewer calls for immediate support. Fewer casualty evacuations. More reports of secured terrain, cleared compounds, abandoned positions. The system stabilized. Apogram, the command structure reflected that change. Reports became more consistent. Timelines aligned. Requests moved through the chain with less urgency, more predictability. The operation, once fragmented, now followed a rhythm. But the cost had already been set. 8 American soldiers killed. Dozens wounded. Aircraft damaged. Timelines extended far beyond initial projections. What had been planned as a rapid encirclement became a prolonged engagement under conditions that had never been fully anticipated. The official outcome was clear. The valley was secured. Enemy forces disrupted. Operational objectives achieved. But outcomes don't erase process. They don't rewrite the first hours. They don't remove the gap between expectation and reality. Because that gap had already done its work. It had exposed the limits of the system. And those limits didn't disappear when the shooting slowed. They remained, embedded in every decision that followed. What changed wasn't the outcome. It was the way they understood the fight. Operation Anaconda ended with the valley under control, but control had never been the real objective. Not in the way it had been defined at the beginning. The original plan assumed that control could be imposed, through speed, through coordination, through overwhelming force applied at the right time. That assumption didn't survive contact. Because the enemy had never intended to win in the way the system defined victory. They didn't need to hold the valley. They needed to shape it. And for the first critical hours, they did. They dictated where helicopters could land. They dictated how units could move. They dictated the tempo of engagement. Not through superior firepower, but through preparation, discipline, and an understanding of terrain that no satellite image could replicate. The United States had entered the valley with unmatched capability. ISR platforms, precision-guided munitions, layered command structures, and some of the most experienced units in the world, from the 75th Ranger Regiment to embedded Air Force combat controllers trained to synchronize air and ground effects under pressure. None of that was missing, but something else was. Alignment. Technology had mapped the environment. It had not mapped the enemy's intent inside it. The assumption of weakness had replaced the need for verification. Signals intelligence had been interpreted as fragmentation. Human intelligence had been accepted as confirmation. A consistent narrative had formed, and once it formed, it became resistant to contradiction. Even when the first helicopters took fire, even when the ridgelines answered before the valley floor, the system didn't fail because it lacked information. It failed because it trusted the wrong version of it. And once that trust was embedded into planning, it propagated through everything: force composition, insertion timing, rules of engagement, command authority. The failure wasn't visible at the start. It was structural. That's why it took time to surface. That's why it couldn't be corrected quickly. What followed wasn't a clean adaptation. It was friction. Command authority had to shift downward under pressure. Air support had to move from centralized precision to responsive persistence. Ground units had to abandon momentum and accept positional survival as a form of progress. These weren't upgrades. They were concessions to reality. The most effective changes weren't technological. They were cognitive. Ground truth began to override projected models. Immediate observation replaced delayed confirmation. Units stopped trying to execute the plan and started responding to the environment in front of them. That shift didn't make the system perfect. It made it functional. And that distinction matters. Because modern warfare is not decided by who has more capability. It's decided by who understands the problem faster. After Anaconda, that understanding began to formalize. Intelligence. Processes were re-evaluated, not in terms of collection, but interpretation. The integration between signals intelligence, human sources, and real-time observation became more critical than the volume of data itself. The idea that consistency equals accuracy was no longer acceptable without friction. Command structures adapted as well. Decentralization wasn't seen as a loss of control, but as a requirement for responsiveness. The authority to act moved closer to the point of contact, where information was immediate and consequences were real. Joint operations began to emphasize synchronization not just of assets, but of understanding. Because synchronization without understanding had already proven its limits. Even air-ground integration evolved. The role of Air Force combat controllers expanded beyond coordination into interpretation, translating fragmented ground reality into actionable air support without waiting for perfect clarity. The threshold for engagement shifted, balancing precision with tempo in a way that reflected the environment, not just the doctrine. And perhaps most importantly, the perception of the enemy changed. Not as a weaker force relying on concealment, but as a thinking force, capable of shaping battle space, capable of exploiting assumptions, capable of operating effectively without technological parity. That recognition didn't come from analysis. It came from contact. From the first burst of machine gun fire into a descending helicopter. From the first failed movement uphill. From the realization that the valley wasn't empty. It was waiting. They didn't lose Operation Anaconda, but they didn't execute it the way they believed they would. And that difference is where the real lesson sits. Because power had never been the issue. They had it. In excess. What they lacked, at the start, was alignment between what they knew and what was real. Once that gap closed, the operation stabilized. Not faster, not cleaner, but correctly. And in modern warfare, that's the distinction that decides everything. They didn't win because they were stronger. They won because, eventually, they stopped assuming they already understood.